Welcome to Appalachian Words, the show about language in Appalachia and the Great Smoky Mountains. I'm your host, Jennifer Heinmiller. I am co-author of the Dictionary of Southern Appalachian and Smoky Mountain English. Appalachian English is a rich language with a long history, but outside of the region, there are more stereotypes than honest conversation about the culture. I wanted to bring this language and its history to a wider audience, so I decided to start this show. Each week, I'll be reading and discussing entries in the dictionary, as well as talking about how the dictionary is set up and the process of compiling it. I welcome your questions, comments, stories, or any other message you'd like to send to me. If you listened to the first episode on YouTube, thank you so much. I really appreciate your support. This is my first adventure in the land of podcasting, and this is a one-woman show, so I really appreciate your patience. Last time, I talked a little about what the dictionary is and how it's structured. If you listen to the episode, or if you've seen the dictionary, you know it's pretty different from what most people think of when they think of a dictionary. Each of the terms has a paragraph of examples that we call citations, which show how the term is used. These citations come from places like memoirs, Civil War letters, diaries, novels, interviews. We even have some citations from personal research. So I should say, if you ever meet me in person, be warned, linguists are always keeping their ears perked up for interesting words to jot down. In this episode, I'd like to talk a little bit about how the dictionary came to be. So earlier, I mentioned how some of the material for the dictionary came from interviews. The first edition of the dictionary, which was edited by my predecessor, Dr. Michael Montgomery, actually based the whole thing on the research by a man called Joseph Sargent Hall. He isn't very well known outside of Appalachia. Let's face it, not much about Appalachia is well known outside of the area. But he was this guy from California who just fell in love with the Great Smoky Mountains. He had a friend, Roy Applebaum, who was a historian at the National Park Service, and this was way back in the 1930s. At that time, Hall was in graduate school at Columbia University in New York. Appleman knew that Hall loved the mountains and their people and culture, and so he invited Hall to come on a 3-month stay to interview people in the area so he could study the way that they spoke. Of course, Hall jumped at the chance, and he came down in the summer of 1937 to do just that. He didn't have any audio recording equipment at that time, and certainly not video equipment. But he filled up 4 handwritten notebooks in that time. So he handwrote all the interviews and he took really detailed notes about words and pronunciation. He also made detailed lists and records about the people he spoke with, writing down their age, occupation, and location when he could. So he came back for a 7-month stay in 1939. That time when he came back, he had full funding from the Park Service and from Columbia University. His mission on that trip was to gather research for his doctoral dissertation. This time, he came with audio recording equipment and he recorded every interview. There are actually pictures of him in the dictionary, of him lugging around these big cases of the recording equipment. On that trip, he ended up filling up 10 more notebooks. So I guess he just got bit by the Appalachia bug because he just couldn't get enough of the mountains. He came back again in 1940, 1941, 1949, 1953, 1956, 1959, 1962, 1967, and 1976. He obviously made a lot of friends in the area, and they took him to events like square dances. It just amazes me to think that this guy, who had no connection to the area originally, felt so drawn to it that it pulled him here so many times and just burrowed a place in his heart. So anyway, he was really the first linguist to gather data on Appalachian speech. He truly is the pioneer of research on the culture and language of the area, and it would be hard to beat his track record. He interviewed more than 200 people in the area over the years, and later in his life he published several books about it. His interviews are also kind of a time capsule. So you have to keep in mind that at the time he recorded, there were still people living who had been born decades before the Civil War, and some people who had been in the Civil War. Some of his interview subjects were actually born in the early 1840s. It just blows my mind. So the huge amount of research that he gathered in those notebooks and audio tapes became the basis for the dictionary. We've expanded it with a ton of other sources, but Hall's work is really the backbone of what we've created. It simply wouldn't have been possible without him. Hall passed away in 1992, and unfortunately I never got the chance to meet him, but I still feel extremely lucky to be able to work with his research and bring it to a modern audience. I mean, really, getting to look at all these words and go over his notes is like being a kid in a candy store for someone like me. Maybe someone else out there can relate? Maybe? I was thinking about the events that Hall might have gone to on his visits to Appalachia, and with the harvest season coming up, I was thinking about some of the get-togethers people might have had back in those days. A great catch-all word that we still use now to some extent is shindig. Usually today, it's used in kind of a tongue-in-cheek way, kind of a joke. In this dictionary, shindig has two meanings, which are both pretty specific. The first is a boisterous gathering or party with live music and dancing. The second is a dance step. It's also called a shindy. For the first citation, I grabbed one from way back. This is a letter written by a Civil War soldier in January 1863 to one of his friends. He says, "You say you and Jacob are having some very amusing times. I would like to have been there at some of your shindigs." It makes you wonder what they got up to, doesn't it? I feel like there's more between the lines here than we can guess at, although maybe we don't want to. Who knows? The next citation is from a book written in 1926 by William Roscoe Thomas called Life Among the Hills and Mountains of Kentucky. He was writing about wedding festivities of the time, and he says, "The night of the same day of the wedding is usually given over to the gay festivities of the square dance or the shindig and old games." Sounds like a pretty good time to me. He mentions old games here, and there are so many of these. If you're curious, let me know and I'll make an episode or two to highlight some of them. The next citation talks about the type of dance called a shindig. This one is from a 1961 book by W. Clark Medford called The Early History of Haywood County, which was talking about Haywood County, North Carolina. If you're familiar with the area, it's west of Asheville. It's this beautiful area, actually, which I like to go to for hiking sometimes. Anyway, he writes, "The old Virginia reel, with its modified forms or figures, was danced to fast time music, like the so-called shindigs and buck dances." A buck dance was another kind of dance that usually men did at some of these parties. I've never actually seen it, but from the name of it, it seems like it would be pretty lively. I'd like to learn more about it, actually. And the last citation I have for us is from a huge collection of interviews called the Great Smoky Mountain National Park Interviews. And these were conducted from 1954 all the way until 1984. All of the interviews, to my knowledge, were done in Gatlinburg in Tennessee. There's a big welcome center to the national park up there. It's kind of the gateway to the national park. It's a really cool place. If you've never been there, they have different exhibits about the history and plants and animals in the area. Really recommend checking it out if you haven't been there yet. So for this citation, I don't know the speaker's name or age, unfortunately, but they were talking about these social gatherings. This one was recorded in 1973, and the speaker said, "I mean, we made a lot of music, but we didn't have what we called shindigs, square dances. On Big Creek, we did have them. About every Saturday night, we would have a square dance and chicken wobble." I think most people are familiar with square dance, and we can gather from this that shindig is kind of another name for a square dance, or at least similar. But a chicken wobble? They just say it so casually, which makes me laugh a little bit. It shows you how common this was in that area back in those days, even though I would guess most of us don't have a clue what it means now. But luckily for us, chicken wobble is also in our dictionary. This is how we define it. Chicken wobble, noun. Formerly a party, usually of men, at which stolen chickens are cooked and there is drinking, music making, tale telling, and other revelry. See also goat wobble. So there's a goat wobble too. Oh boy. Who knows how many other wobbles there are. So let's just let that one be for now. On that note, it's Labor Day weekend here, and I'm sure people are up to all sorts of shindigs and other fun things. It's sort of the unofficial start to fall, isn't it? There's so many festivals and events throughout the mountains in the fall. It's really a fun time to be here. Someone told me there's a big traditional music festival up in Virginia this weekend. It's called the Papa Joe Smiddy Mountain Music Festival. It's going to be at the Natural Tunnel State Park on September 1st, and it's a celebration of Appalachian mountain heritage, culture, and music. Sounds like a fun shindig to me. Well, that's all I have for this week. As always, I welcome your comments, questions, stories, and suggestions. Feel free to drop me a line at appalachian.dictionary@gmail.com or leave a comment in the comments section below. I'll put information about that festival that I mentioned and the words we talked about today in the show notes. Keep an eye on this space for new episodes each week. Until next week.